National Spy Museum. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the historian and curator here at SPY. Welcome you all to the beginning of our spring Smithsonian Spy Seminar series. We're very excited to do this, as we are every time. This one's going to be interesting in its own special ways. I think we're going to get a little wonky, which we like to do here at the Spy Museum, looking at how secrets are stolen, kind of the fundamentals of intelligence tradecraft. And this week kicks it off, and then we have 3 great weeks following with very diverse speakers. Every so often when Amanda Olkey, our director of adult programming, puts together the speaker list, I always like to take a peek as she's doing it, and this was one of those like, oh wow, we really have different views and different people and different ideas coming that, we always have different types of people, but this one is, you're gonna get 4 very different talks, which is always fun. Just a note, if we love seeing all of you here. Some of you are certainly familiar faces that we've seen here before, but this is not all that the Spy Museum does. We actually have a lot of programming coming up this spring. Spring is one of our great times for programming. If you have a chance to grab one of these communiques on your way out, if you haven't grabbed one on your way in, you can see a lot of the adult programming that we do throughout the spring. Many of them are in the evening, some of them during the day, some of them are free, some of them are less than you'd spend to go to a movie. Just so we can keep our GS and security people here after hours. And they're fascinating, and they're an opportunity to hear from, again, people like today, like Stephen Budiansky, hear from people who are experts in the field or were in the field themselves at some point. So it's worth checking out. If you forget to grab one, you can always look at our calendar on spymuseum.org and see everything that's coming up. Let me introduce our speaker today. He's a great friend of the museum. This is not his first rodeo here with us. He's been here several times, and we keep asking him to come back because not only is he an extraordinarily good, I guess, can I call you a journalist or a former journalist? Yes, recovering journalist. But he has really unique insight on the intelligence community that others don't have because of his background. As I read his bio, you'll pick up a little bit on what he comes with when he attacks these kinds of historical problems. And he's the author of 17 books about military history, intelligence, espionage, science, the natural world, and some other subjects. His writing has appeared in a lot of places. I'm not going to name all of them, but the Atlantic Monthly, New York Times Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Economist, and lots of other publications. He received his, here's where you're going to get a different direction, his Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry from Yale and a Master's of Science degree in applied mathematics from Harvard. So the science side of this is really where you're going to get a unique perspective on what you're going to hear today. From 79 to 82, he was a magazine editor and radio producer for the American Chemical Society here in Washington, D.C. From 82 to 85, he was Washington correspondent and then Washington editor of the scientific journal Nature. And Nature's always one of those weird, where you hear the name, you're like, oh, it's about leaves and trees. No, this is the preeminent scientific journal arguably in the world. If you've ever grabbed a copy and think that you're going to read about, birds, it's not. This is where the top scientists in the world are putting their peer-reviewed papers. In 85 and 86, he was a congressional fellow at the U.S. Congress Office of Technology Assessment, where he co-authored a study of advanced conventional weapons technology. In 86, he joined the staff of U.S. News and World Report, where he kind of started his journalism background, where he worked the next 12 years in a variety of writing and editing positions, including national security correspondent, foreign editor, and deputy editor. He's also a member of the editorial board of Cryptologia, the scholarly journal of cryptology and intelligence history. I'll give you, again, he wrote 17 books, just a couple notable ones. His notable books include Blackett's War, The Men Who Defeated the Nazi U-Boats and Brought Science to the Art of Warfare, Her Majesty's Spy Master, Elizabeth I, Sir Francis Walsingham, and the Birth of Modern Espionage, and a book on cryptology called Battle of Wits, The Complete Story of Codebreaking in World War II. His latest book, which he will be happy to stay after and sign copies of, is Code Warriors, NSA's Codebreakers in the Secret Intelligence War Against the Soviet Union. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Budiansky.
Well, thank you, Vince. Thank you all for braving the notorious Washington wintry mix, which when I moved to Washington many years ago, I learned is the local term for rain. Well, as Vince mentioned, my most recent book is right on the topic I'm talking about today, Code Warriors, available at find spy museums everywhere. To understand code breaking and NSA in the Cold War, we have to go back to code breaking in World War II. And for that matter, to understand NSA and code breaking today, we have to go back to World War II. And as the war approached its end, there was a surprisingly great divergence of views about what should become of this vast code breaking system that had been developed during the war. Should it be retained into peacetime? World War II had brought a true revolution in what we now today would call SIGINT, signals intelligence. Back then it was called communications intelligence, sometimes radio intelligence. But whatever the name, it meant intercepting communications, generally electronic communications, cable traffic, radio traffic. If necessary, breaking the codes that were used to conceal the meaning of these messages, and then extracting usable intelligence from these messages and ideally getting it in the hands of political and military leaders in time for them to put it to effective use. The most famous example of this from the war was the breaking of the German Enigma machine. Code breaking, of course, goes back centuries, but really it was the rise of radio that created this unprecedented opportunity. It used to be you had to, in the days of written communications, you had to waylay, seduce, or knock on the head a messenger and actually get physical control of a message before you could even start the business of trying to break a code. With radio, if you had a receiver in a favorable location, you could pick it off of the airwaves and the target wouldn't even know you'd done it. And moreover, SIGINT provided a direct line into the orders and plans of the enemy at the highest level. Here's General Guderian, the Nazi panzer commander in World War II. You can see down in the lower left an Enigma machine on his command car there in use. This wasn't scuttlebutt. This wasn't some company clerk ordering a few more lanterns. This was the highest level of the enemy, in theory at least, in possibility that you were tapping into. Well, it was a revolution not just in capabilities, not just in technical capabilities, but in bringing about a fundamental change in how military commanders and political leaders even viewed intelligence. Winston Churchill had been an early convert, interestingly enough. In the First World War, as First Lord of the Admiralty, he had become a real enthusiast for the work of Room 40, as it was called. This was the code-breaking bureau in the British Admiralty in the First World War that achieved some quite significant successes in breaking reading German Navy codes. And when he became First Lord and then Prime Minister in World War II, he was one of the leading proponents of signals intelligence. As he called it, news of the kind that never fails. But even at the start of World War II, it had been a real hard sell with generals and admirals who were used to viewing intelligence with considerable contempt. Spies were disreputable, unsavory people. Worst of all, they were civilian, disreputable, unsavory people. But, there wasn't good reason to trust the reports that they gave. They were unlikely to be timely. They were often based on rumors or inference or fabricated in their entirety, for that matter. Commanders weren't about to risk in a military operation based on something some spy of unknown reliability fed to them. Even the official files of the Army and Navy intelligence agencies, offices, tended to be outdated, historical, static information. And in fact, intelligence was really a dumping ground. If you didn't know what else to do with some failed officer, you stuck him in intelligence. And so it was a vicious circle. It was contempt bred incompetence, which bred further contempt. Peter Calvacoresi, who became one of the senior intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park in World War II, the British code-breaking establishment, had an account of that I think well encapsulated this attitude. It was 1940. He was a barrister in London, wanted to contribute something to the war effort. When the Nazis invaded France, he presented himself at the War Office in London and said, I'd like to become an officer. Is there something I can do? And he spent the day being shunted from one office to another and given examinations and interviewed. Finally, at the end of the day, he's brought in to see a colonel. And standing in front of the colonel's desk, he took a surreptitious glance down at the papers in front of the colonel. And reading upside down, he saw it was the report on his various tests and interviews. And at the very bottom was the verdict. It said, no good, not even for intelligence. But SIGINT was something completely different. Rafe Bennett, who I actually interviewed shortly before he died, he'd been a scholar of German medieval history, a student at Cambridge when the war broke out, ended up working as a senior Army analyst at Bletchley Park. And then after the war, when finally some of the information about Ultra, as it was called, the product of reading the Enigma, was released, he wrote a history of Ultra in North Africa. And as he said, what breaking the Enigma messages and other enemy traffic provided was something that surpassed the wildest dreams of the greatest spy in the world. To be able to discover directly from the mouths of the highest commanders the most vital operational secrets of the enemy, to deliver them to his own side within hours, and to do this not once in a once-in-a-lifetime coup, but over and over again. And as he said, well, how would generals and admirals react to this unprecedented source of information? And the answer was, at least at first, with still some of the same stubbornness, suspicion of civilians and experts, especially suspicion of technical experts, I think, in those days in the British military, resentment of outsiders presuming to tell them how to run their war for them. Well, it took a certain amount of time, but results on the battlefield spoke loudest. The interception and disabling of the German battleship Bismarck, a direct result of Enigma intelligence. The Battle of Midway, a famous example in American code-breaking history, where the reading of Japanese high-level naval codes allowed U.S. commanders to anticipate Japanese plans to attack Midway and be there first and ambush the Japanese fleet. The North African campaign, where the breaking of the relevant Enigma key there gave Bletchley Park literally every day Rommel's list of supply needs, his supply reports. What was he running short of? Was it anti-tank ammunition? Was it diesel fuel? Was it gasoline? Was it food? Was it tank ammunition? And then from breaking Italian naval codes, they knew exactly which ships were crossing the Mediterranean, laden with which supplies, when they would sail, and they were able to directly target the ships carrying the supplies Rommel was most short of and most in need of. An extraordinary use of intelligence that I think really brought a lot of converts from the remaining holdouts in the British Army. The Battle of the Atlantic, where the fight against the Nazi U-boats was above all an intelligence war. It shifted back and forth because the Germans were breaking the Allied convoy code at times, but the triumph against the U-boats was completely, I would say, an intelligence triumph. It allowed Allied convoys to know where U-boats were waiting, where their patrol lines were waiting, and take evasive routing around them. It allowed for, by the summer of 1943, a deadly effective campaign of ambushing and attacking U-boats at their refueling points at sea, and it really, I think, was the decisive factor in the Battle of the Atlantic. And D-Day. The breaking of the Japanese diplomatic code by the U.S. Army before the war, probably America's Ultra, a feat equivalent to the breaking of the German Enigma machine, allowed the Allies to read messages from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin back to Tokyo. He had taken an extensive tour of the German fortifications along the Atlantic, sent back voluminous reports, an unbelievable mine of information for Allied commanders and planners to know what the status of the German Western Wall fortifications were. Well, so one revolution was the revolution of just results. But behind this were, I think, some more subtle revolutions, which also weighed heavily on the minds of American and British intelligence leaders who were trying to figure out, well, should we even retain this in the post-war world? And what sort of capability will we need in peacetime? Because the other thing the SIGINT revolution had done, among other things, was mobilize an extraordinary intellectual, technological, and scientific body of talent. Here's Alan Turing, the famous British mathematician who played a seminal role in figuring out the attack on Enigma. Probably second only to the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project, in this mobilization of scientific talent at the highest level in the service of intelligence. It also, I think, transformed, though, I mean, here on the one hand, I'm talking about geniuses, but it became a massive institution, almost an assembly line, thousands of people brought in. And, you know, we think of code breaking in the past as this arcane art, this mysterious thing, the lone seat of the pants, cryptanalysts working something out. And what the war did was turn this into almost a sort of industrial assembly line. And that was something a lot of leaders realized would be hard to reproduce. The war brought this first mechanization of code breaking. This is one of the famous bombs, they were called, for reasons that are too arcane to go into right now, but it was an electromechanical computing device used to solve the Enigma traffic. These were made by National Cash Register. There were almost 100 of them made in the United States. There were ones in Britain as well. And the forerunners of truly the first digital computers, this was a British machine called Colossus that was used to break German teleprinter codes. It had digital circuitry. It still had a lot of paper tape, as you could see, running over these spindles. I interviewed Jack Good, who worked on this. He was a brilliant mathematician, and then he came to the US and spent many years as a statistician down at Virginia Tech. And he told me, he was describing all of this, and he said, you know, I still consider it one of the great secrets of the war that ordinary teletype paper tape could be run at 30 miles an hour without breaking. But there were, you know, a lot of these great innovations that really did directly lead to the first digital computers after the war. Now, a little more background, because I mentioned thousands of people working in this code-breaking factories, you might almost call them. This had grown out of, I could say, I can't say literally nothing, but almost literally nothing, because in 1929, the US Army's code-breaking establishment consisted of this man, William Friedman. Friedman was, I think, quite typical of the eclectic backgrounds of code breakers. He was from a Russian Jewish family. He came to the United States as an infant. He went to Michigan Agricultural College, as it was known then, because the tuition was free, he said. He took only one math course in college. And then he got a job at something called the Riverbank Institution, one of these bizarre things that only could happen in America. A rich industrialist had founded this research institution, and it was mainly dedicated to studies of plant genetics, and that's what Friedman had studied in college. But he also had this hobby horse of wanting to prove that Shakespeare's plays were written by Francis Bacon, and he was convinced there were coded messages in Shakespeare's plays that gave this away. And Friedman ended up transferring to this project, teaching himself completely, because there was almost no resources then, teaching himself about cryptology. In 1921, fed up with eccentric rich guys funding research institutions, he got a job with the Signal Corps. The Signal Corps at that time was really only in code making in their involvement with codes, and he spent 8 years working on code making. In 1929, the State Department shut down the so-called Black Chamber, the code-breaking bureau that had lasted since World War I. And so Friedman became essentially the sole code breaker in the United States government. Well, his great strength, though, I think, was as an organizer, a systematizer, a teacher. He developed the first training courses. This was Elements of Cryptanalysis, which was still being used, I believe, by NSA in the 50s, 60s, and I don't know, maybe even now as the introductory course. He coined the terms cryptanalysis, meaning code breaking, cryptology, the study of codes, cryptography, meaning code making or code writing. His great strength, too, was that he simply was unafraid of any problem. And when I started writing about codes, I thought, well, I need to learn something about the actual nuts and bolts of this. And I tried going through some of these exercises, and I found I had no talent for this, mainly because you have to believe that all of this trial and error is really going to lead to a solution to get yourself to even get off square one. And that was Friedman's great strength. He was always convinced that he could find a solution, and he generally did. In 1930, he was authorized to hire 3 junior assistants. Here's a slightly later picture of his staff. A bit of Washington history. They were, at that time, located in the munitions building. This is a view from the Washington Monument looking west. Those comb-shaped buildings on your right were the munitions building and the main Navy building. They were so-called temporary buildings built during World War I. They were torn down in 1970. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary building, is the Washington saying. Franklin D. Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, said, I'm going to put these right smack in front of the White House because it'll be such an eyesore, they'll have to be torn down after the war. But President Wilson complained that he thought all the sawing and hammering would bother him, so FDR reluctantly agreed to have it moved a mile down the mall. And years later, it was in the 1940s, in fact, FDR said, it was a sin for which I should be kept out of heaven, he said, for destroying the plan of, he said, of the most beautiful city in the world. When the war came, the Army and Navy were empowered to seize property. And the Army quickly seized for its code-breaking establishment Arlington Hall, which was a girls' school, still government property. I think the State Department uses it for their language training now. You see Arlington Hall in the lower left. Not to be outdone, the Navy seized its own girls' school, Mount Vernon Academy in Northwest Washington near American University. That's still Navy property. The story I read that was going around Washington in the first months of the war was that if the Army and Navy could capture enemy territory as quickly as they were seizing property around Washington, the war would be over in a few weeks. As I said, Arlington Hall was this girls' school. Here was a postcard from before the war showing the girls on their nice horses there, and there were tennis courts and indoor and outdoor riding arenas, and the one of the Army recruiters who was trying to find young men and women in particular to come work there shamelessly would show around these postcard pictures of the campus before the war. And of course, when they got there, they found it was the same old government temporary buildings that had been slapped up, and there were barracks all over what had been the horseback riding arena, and it was barbed wire fences all around, and it wasn't quite the romantic thing that they had thought. Well, at the start of World War II, the Army still had only 19 codebreakers working in its Washington headquarters, the Navy 36. And the war led to this explosive growth. By the end, the Army had nearly 8,000 people working in Washington in code breaking, the Navy 5,000. There were tens of thousands of more in the field working on interception and low-level codes. So there were results on the battlefield. There was this institution that had been created. And one of the other extraordinary things that had happened during the war was the U.S.-British alliance in code breaking. Now, it was really an unprecedented, or it was a rare thing for nations, even allies, to share important secrets with one another then. It was unprecedented for them to share intelligence secrets, and it was unthinkable to share signals intelligence methods with another country, because there was this great concern that if you let even a hint out of a capability to break code, this would put potential targets on the alert, and they would change their code systems, and it would undo all of the work that you had done. In September 1940, the height of the Battle of Britain, great fears of cross-channel invasion by the Nazis, Churchill was quite eager, as he put it, to get the United States and Britain somewhat mixed up together, and ultimately, of course, hoping the United States would enter the war. One of the things they did was to have some of the top U.S. military and naval intelligence peoples come to the embassy in London, and General Strong related how, head of Army Intelligence, that one day in discussions with his British colleagues, he casually mentioned that he'd be interested in anything about the fortifications on certain Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. That afternoon, this motorcade pulls up in front of the embassy. Men come in with guards on their flanks carrying what turned out to be the entire British intelligence files on the subject, plunked them on his desk, and I like this, asked him to sign a receipt for them. And so, I mean, the charm offensive was definitely on. And Strong, apparently on his own volition, almost offhandedly raised the subject with his British counterparts, whether they would consider an exchange of cryptologic information. Well, the British were astonished, but Churchill again personally intervened over the objections of the head of the British Secret Service, who said Americans couldn't be trusted to keep their mouths shut, to say, we're going to make this happen. It was, of course, an extremely sensitive thing. America was officially still neutral at this point. There was it was a very delicate political situation with FDR trying to help the British against a lot of isolationist opposition in the United States, particularly from the Republican Party at that time. And so any public word of this sort of cooperation would be very damaging. But they agreed that 2 Army and 2 Navy officers would come over. They'd be shown around Bletchley Park and other facilities, stations that were involved in intercept work. They were, to keep the cover of this, they were told to wear civilian clothes, of course, and to anyone not directly in the know, they were to explain that they were Canadians. And the cover was almost immediately blown because the 2 Army officers were being driven to go see, I think, an intercept station, and they're in this official War Department staff car driven by an Army sergeant. And they're stopped by a constable in this small town who was started asking the 2 men in the back in obviously not English-looking civilian suits, what they were doing, and started getting evasive answers, and finally said, I think you're going to have to come down to the station and answer a few more questions, at which point their Scottish driver leapt out in fury, and he said, "You cannot do this! They're Americans on a secret mission!" True story, yeah, okay. But it was a success. The Americans, again to the astonishment of the British, brought a copy of one of the duplicated purple machines that they had made, the Japanese high-level diplomatic code machines, and the British very reluctantly started sharing their progress on the Enigma with the Americans. And it ultimately led to a formal, and here's Bletchley Park, by the way, some of the chess-playing characters, and there's Alan Turing in his cross-country gear, and one of the so-called huts, which were these, of course, chilly, temporary huts where a lot of the work was done at Bletchley Park. It led to a formal agreement whose descendants are still in effect. This was called the Brusa Agreement, the Britain, then U.S. Army agreement, formalizing sharing of at least military cryptologic information and results and methods between Britain and U.S., later expanded to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as well. Well, one of the things that the British particularly brought to the table here in 1945 that the Americans were thinking about was their intercept capability. The British Empire was still extended around the world. They had lots of locations where they could, that were favorable for intercepting communications. And they also were less concerned about the niceties of some of these things. Cables that carried commercial cable traffic, undersea cables, many of them passed through Britain, and the British had very little compunction about tapping into those. And as one American codebreaker noted in writing a memorandum about what should we do after the war, he said the British were unhampered by doubts as to the proprieties of the methods used. So, in the summer of 1945, President Truman faced this decision on what to do with this remarkable enterprise and capability that the war had created. There were great pressures for demobilization, especially for quickly wrapping up anything that smacked of, what then would have been called un-American. Things that were wartime emergency measures, but went against deeply held American values, government control of the economy, censorship, and certainly covert operations of any kind. There was also this real desire to get things back to normal as quickly as possible. As Eric Goldman, the historian, wrote of this period, he said, "It was a deep-seated American belief that foreign policy was something you had, like measles, and got over with as quickly as possible." And there were questions, too, of whether what had been a necessity in wartime was ethical or even legal in peacetime. The law was unclear on whether the government actually had the authority to, in peacetime, to read cable traffic or even to intercept radio messages and pass them on to a third party. Many of those who knew these most closely guarded secrets of SIGINT's success shared those concerns. The Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Edwards, warned Truman that spying in peacetime would be sure to leak out. It was against the principles of the collective security regime that the United States was trying to build right after the war to be engaged in this sort of activity. And also there was the question, for what? Very little of value was coming in. There was this publication, distributed every day to top officials called the Magic Daily Summary that had the cream of the results of reading Japanese and German messages during the war. And it went in a matter of days with the end of the war from the innermost secrets of the German and Japanese regime to the elections in Romania and the future of French parochial schools in the Congo, literally. I mean, it was the dregs. And so there was a lot of doubt about whether this enterprise was even worth it. On the other hand, there was the fear of repeating what had happened after World War I. There was a very keen sense of how hard it had been to rebuild this capability that had been allowed to let slide. And then I think finally, as Captain Wenger, the head of the Navy code-breaking operations, noted with a great deal of prescience, the atomic bomb had changed everything. There was really no such thing as peacetime anymore. The Russians were sure to develop a bomb of their own eventually, and SIGINT would be the only thing that might give us advance warning of an atomic attack. Now, the very secrecy of this whole program, of course, made it an easier decision than it otherwise would have been, and in the summer of '45, Truman ordered the programs continued, said it's up to the Army and Navy to decide whether to continue cooperation with Britain, which they did. And several developments quickly reinforced his judgments. One was, nothing succeeds like success. And in 1944, at Arlington Hall, a very small program, secret even by Arlington Hall's standard, began to tackle Soviet diplomatic messages sent in code. Now, the Soviets were our ally at that time, extremely sensitive thing to be doing. These were diplomatic cables. They were sent over commercial cable companies under wartime censorship. All of the cables were delivered to the US government and could be read, but they were all in code. More than that, it was clear they had been enciphered with one-time pads, which are unbreakable if used correctly. But it became clear for a brief period, 1944 to 45 mainly, the Soviets had made a mistake. And it was theoretically possible to start to break and read some of these messages. And by 45, 46, 47, it became clear these were not ordinary diplomatic cables. These were not cables about consular matters. They were nothing less than communications from between the KGB and its agents and spies in the United States. The effort against the Soviet code systems was also given a great boost by a project that was called TICOM. Now, in the waning days of the war, there were a number of scientific technical teams put together with the aim of following the lead U.S. Allied forces as they made their way into Germany and seizing information, equipment, and people involved in the German atomic bomb program, the German rocket program, and, for TICOM, German cryptologic programs. There were several aims. One was to see how far the Germans had got. There was some concern maybe they had broken some Allied codes, shared this with the Japanese, who we were going to still be fighting indefinitely at that point. So we wanted to know that. We wanted to keep cryptanalytic information from leaking out in general. They wanted to secure any documents that might give away basic techniques in cryptanalysis. And the unstated, but also, I think, very high priority concern was to grab German cryptologic excerpts before the Russians got them. Well, one of these TICOM teams were put together mainly from American and British cryptanalysts who were working at Bletchley Park. America had a large contingent over at Bletchley. They were all sort of civilians in uniform, nominally under the Signal Corps detachment. And being the Army, of course, they had a regular Army sergeant who was always tearing his hair out at these guys from MIT under him who were, barely knew how to put their uniforms on properly. And when he heard that some of these guys were being sent over to Germany, he said to one of them, he said, the war must really be over if they're sending you guys. Well, this was one of the TICOM team's find. A soldier had drowned in a lake in Bavaria, and when they were dragging the lake, they hooked on a large metal box. And it turned out to contain a lot of interesting documents. They then continued dragging and came up with, I think, something like a dozen more of these boxes. It turned out to be the complete archives of the German High Command Cryptologic Unit. These were flown back to Bletchley Park instantly. Other equipment was found. Another TICOM team found a small unit, and these guys admitted they had buried their equipment, and it was equipment used to break Russian teleprinter codes. This is actually a German teleprinter system, but it was very similar to what they figured the Russian one was. These guys were brought back to Britain, and they were set to work doing what they quaintly called their homework, which was to write up little reports of everything they had done in tackling Russian codes. And these are some of their, actual reports here, showing what they had worked out, and particularly on this machine. This was a Hagelin machine that had been sold to the Russians and modified. It was called the B211. It was used mainly in the Soviet Far East. And also this German teleprinter system. Well, the other thing I think that quickly confirmed the wisdom of keeping this code-breaking operations alive was, of course, Stalin's increasing hard line. George Kennan, the American diplomat, had noted by the spring of '46 that the end of the war had really achieved the only objective Stalin shared with any of his allies, namely military victory. He had no intention in cooperating to achieve stability in Europe. And the blockade of Berlin and the Berlin airlift certainly confirmed this. The other thing I think that confirmed the wisdom of keeping this code-breaking and SIGINT capability alive was the abject failure of other traditional intelligence means. The USSR at this point, of course, was a completely closed society, heavy secret police presence, informers. It was extraordinarily difficult to get any information out. It was extraordinarily difficult to infiltrate any agents in. The OSS, the wartime spy agency's successor, were very optimistic about the idea of parachuting agents into Soviet-held territory, as they'd done with Germany in World War II. And we know now that every single one of hundreds was betrayed ahead of time, many by Kim Philby, the famous Soviet spy who worked in British intelligence. And they were all either shot or turned as double agents. There wasn't one successful operation. And it was already clear to others that this was a terrible waste and a failure. And in one showdown between the US Army and the CIA station chief in Berlin, I think in '47 or '48, he said to the CIA, the only thing you're proving by continuing to parachute these agents in is the law of gravity. Well, NSA's forerunners in the late '40s began to attack the Russian problem, as they called it, with growing intensity, and building on wartime advances began developing increasingly powerful cryptanalytic machines. This is one early special purpose digital code-breaking machine built right after the war. And in fact, very quickly, the crypto agencies became the foremost driving force in the development of digital computers in the '50s, '60s, and '70s. Several Navy crypto veterans founded this company, Engineering Research Associates, primarily to build secret code-breaking machines for the Navy, but they built what became one of the first commercial digital computers. Here was actually a marketing brochure for it. The ERA 1101, which became the UNIVAC 1101 when UNIVAC bought them out. And in fact, in the ensuing years, machines built for NSA or to its specifications achieved a number of computing milestones. The first magnetic disk memory, the first magnetic core memory, the first all-transistor computer, the first computer workstation, the first desktop computer, the first high-speed tape drive, first high-speed modems, and the first supercomputer, all built for NSA. Not to say this wouldn't have happened anyway, but it was clearly, it happened much faster than it otherwise would have. Well, in the late 40s, there was a considerable amount of success achieved in reading Soviet codes, as I'd mentioned. Then suddenly, in November 1948, came an event which in NSA lore is still called Black Friday, though it actually happened over a weekend. But it was a wholesale change in all military code systems. Nothing like this had ever happened before. It was such an alarming development that briefly London and Washington considered the possibility it was an indication the Soviets were about to launch a major attack on Germany and Western Europe. Because you don't normally make this kind of across-the-board change in code systems. Well, the other possibilities that they considered was it was just routine improvements in security, as happen all the time, or that it might have been a reaction to a leak about US code-breaking success. That would actually turn out to be the truth. But there were larger forces at work as well that were working against the code breakers. Well, today, you have a supercomputer in your pocket, literally. I mean, what would have been considered a supercomputer 40 years ago, 30 years ago even, you have in your pocket. The capability of making codes is widely distributed. It wasn't like in the 1950s when there was a handful of people in the world who could afford powerful computers. So in the hands of the code breakers, you know, they had the advantage over whatever a code maker could come up with. And in the early 50s, NSA had a report done by Bell Labs experts who said this. He said the advantages will be increasingly in favor of the cryptographer as against the cryptanalyst. Technology is irresistibly making the situation worse rather than better. Now, the Soviets were, had some ironic advantages in being less technologically capable. They had captured some German Enigma machines in World War II. They had learned and applied some of the lessons of the Enigma machine's weaknesses. One of the particular weaknesses of the Enigma was that for all of its complex methods of scrambling the identity of one letter to another and changing it with each successive letter, it could never encipher a letter with itself. In other words, E could never be enciphered with E. By the same token, at any given position, it had reciprocal properties of encipherment. If E was enciphered as B, then B would be enciphered as E at that particular spot. And the Russians applied this. This was a code machine used, we're not sure, we in the civilian world, but they've come into the hands of collectors. They're on the collector's market. You can buy one. It's called Fialka. It was probably used at least as early as the 70s, maybe earlier. And it's very cleverly solved these problems. Not only did it have 10 rotors instead of 3 or 4, as you can see, but the rotors moved in opposite directions, each adjacent ones. One went one way, the next one went the opposite direction. Much more complicated problem to solve. And it had one little, it was all mainly electromechanical, but it had one little electronic circuit that chose one letter to be, one group of 3 letters to be enciphered in a circular arrangement, which messed up this mirror image encipherment business, and it allowed one other letter to be enciphered with itself at any position. It was enough to cause a huge complication. And in fact, as far as I can tell, no high-level Soviet codes were broken from Black Friday of 1948, probably for 3 decades afterwards. The other thing the Soviets had going for them was that they put a lot more emphasis on spies than we did, and bugging. If you can't break a message, you can steal it. And it's interesting that this project of reading the KGB cables I mentioned, the one-time pad messages, later became known as Venona, the last cover name used, it provided some of our most important information about Soviet spies. It identified Donald McLean, another one of the Cambridge 5 spies, along with Philby. And it became itself the target of Soviet spies. Philby, when he came to Washington in 48, as the top British Secret Service liaison, made it his business to haunt Arlington Hall and to find out the results of the Russian project, and in fact was able to alert Moscow about the impending arrest of this atomic spies, Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, and others. There was another Soviet spy at Arlington Hall, William Wiseband, who was a U.S. Army soldier, linguist, and he was exposed not by the Venona cables, but almost by chance, another Soviet spy who had worked in the American aircraft factories on the West Coast identified him to the FBI. He was fired by Arlington Hall in 48. He served a year in jail for contempt for refusing to appear before a grand jury. And at NSA's insistence, the case was dropped because they knew to prosecute him would have to reveal secrets they didn't want revealed in open court. But he worked on Venona in its early days, and we know from the brief period when the Soviet KGB archives were opened, during that brief window of hope and opportunity in the 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union, that in fact he had tipped off the Russians about the success of breaking some of their codes, and that was what led to Black Friday. Well, what did that leave the US and the British to do? Well, there was a huge amount of Russian traffic, commercial cable traffic, telegrams, that were sent in plain text. They were just ordinary telegrams. The peculiarity about the Russians was that because so many of their landlines had been destroyed in the war, and because it was such a vast country to begin with, most of this traffic in the late 40s and early 50s was still going over radio links, which could be easily intercepted. One of the NSA linguists who urged that this traffic be studied was told, well, this is a waste of time. If the Russians considered it important, they'd encrypt it. And it was a real needle in a haystack operation. But he insisted, and others were enthusiastic, including William Friedman, who was sort of the grand old man at this point, a consultant, and he thought it was worthwhile. And in fact, by piecing together little bits of information, bank account numbers, rail car loadings, personnel requests, NSA and CIA were able to put together from these plain language telegrams the most complete picture of the Soviet arms industry, the structure of its government, which was a complete secret under Stalin, the only really reliable information on the Soviet atomic program at that time, and the only reliable indicators of the kinds of events that might indicate mass mobilization for war. Now, as you can see by these numbers, I mean, they were reading 1.3 million of these messages a month. They would be intercepted, they would be punched on paper tape. The paper tape would be physically shipped to Arlington Hall. Then it had to be scanned and the wheat from the chaff sorted out, printed out. And the job mainly fell, the drudgery of this mainly fell to this segregated, all African-American unit. And Jack Gurin, the man I mentioned who'd been pushing this, whose job it basically was to just feed this tape into the machines and print it out all day long. It was dirty, noisy work. And Gurin came in one day to see how this was all working on the end of the operation he hadn't seen. And he said, I just couldn't believe this. He said they were all college graduates. Most had been to Howard University. And he said their job was to feed the tape into the machine. When it jammed, unjam the tape, and then continue it. And so he tried to do what he could, and he at least taught many of the workers in this section to some basic Russian, told them, how they could hold up the tape, look at the initial address, and be able to see if it was something important, and that was a slightly better job. It's still astonishing for us to think of, the assumptions of and the that were built into segregation in those days. And it wasn't until the 50s that mid-50s, that things really began to change at NSA. And in fact, though, many of the early African-American workers in this unit in the 60s and 70s rose to senior management positions at NSA, those who were willing to stick with it. And there was a wonderful oral history called The Invisible Cryptologists, done by a historian at NSA. And she did oral histories with many of these men and women. And she said, who sardonically was called the plantation where they worked, which is a rather mordant bit of humor, or not really humor about it. Well, plain text also allowed for the significant successes that were achieved during the Korean War. Milt Zaslow, a Chinese linguist who was studying plain text Chinese messages during the war, noticed that there were a whole bunch of telegrams being sent by Chinese soldiers to their families at home saying, I'm safe, arrived safely here. And he noticed they were coming from the railway line leading up to the North Korean border. And he finally realized that there was this huge Chinese troop movement up to the North Korean border. And he kept warning, this looks like the Chinese are about to intervene. And MacArthur, of course, who always claimed that he understood what he called the Oriental mind, assured Truman that it was impossible. The Chinese were not going to intervene in the war. And of course, the rest was history. One of the other significant things that was done, again, without any high-level code breaking, but what was called traffic analysis, or TA, and TA fusion, was pulling together information from different sources to produce valuable, usable intelligence. The Air Force and the Army had separately been intercepting various transmissions. There were ground-to-air control voice transmissions, Soviets, Chinese, North Koreans, all separately. There were Morse code messages coming from North Korean radar stations that were tracking both friendly and enemy aircraft. Very simple code, easy to break. And finally, when these were all brought together to one unit that could fuse them, it absolutely transformed the air war because it allowed U.S. forces to know far in advance when an incoming MiG raid was going to happen, where it was, far beyond the radar range of U.S. aircraft, and it produced a stunning increase in kill ratios. Likewise, again, without breaking codes, NSA and CIA correctly predicted the Soviet intervention in the Hungarian revolt in 1956. The method here was mainly radio direction finding. If you could associate certain kinds of signals and certain frequencies with certain kinds of units, and you could triangulate on them by having two different receiver stations, get a fix on them. If you saw they moved, you didn't even have to read the messages to know, hey, this tank division isn't where it was. And this provided, in fact, the crucial intelligence that CIA was able to offer of Soviet intervention in 1956 in Hungary. The great intelligence failure, probably the greatest since Pearl Harbor, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where NSA's inability to read high-level traffic caused them to completely miss the installation of nuclear-armed medium-range missiles. But they did know something was up, because there were many what they called love and kisses messages being sent from Russians back home. So they saw, yeah, there's like thousands of Russians coming into Cuba. Much of Cuba's telephone system went over microwaves, and a Navy ship stationed not far off the coast was able to intercept a lot of this. And one day they picked up two bored Cuban airmen talking at two different bases, and one of them says, we all have to learn Russian. Right, that was kind of interesting. But in the midst of the crisis, again, NSA, again, just with non-code breaking techniques, these traffic analysis, direction finding methods, provided the crucial information that the Soviets were backing down. Kennedy had ordered a blockade, which we politely called a quarantine of Cuba, and this was the climax of the crisis. Were the Russians going to back down? And there were a large number of Russian merchant vessels still heading towards Cuba with additional supplies. They read a message in the clear, which went out to the merchant fleet from a powerful Russian radio station saying, be prepared to receive an important coded message at noon today. The message came, NSA could not read the message, but they were able to see from transmissions from the ships, direction finding, the ships had stopped and some had even turned around. Well, I mentioned the explosive growth of NSA's predecessors in World War II and how it had turned this arcane lone art into something more like an assembly line process. And of course, like any assembly line process, there was a lot of drudgery. During the war, there was the compensation of this feeling of wartime urgency and the knowledge that it would end in a finite amount of time. Now NSA was faced with the challenge of trying to persuade people not just to put their careers on temporary hold while we win the war, but to give up the idea of ever having a normal career, really, and accept a lifetime of drudgery and secrecy, of not even being able to tell your family what you did, or even tell a prospective future private employer what you'd been doing for the last 10 years, say, which really put a crimp on the idea that you could ever get a normal job in those days if you once went to work for NSA. So there were huge efforts made to improve morale, which sort of also heightened this sort of strange, almost absurd contradiction between being, a secret intelligence officer and punching a time clock. I mean, it was like coming to work at an insurance agency or something. And General Canine, the first director of NSA, was very concerned about this. He said, we need to do something at least to make employees not feel like they're convicts coming in and behind this barbed wire fence. Arlington Hall the buildings were terrible there. They were unair conditioned, notoriously rat infested, and so Canine really pushed for NSA's new headquarters to be built at Fort Meade, Maryland. And it was very nice, this modern building, air conditioned. Of course, it was in the middle of absolutely nowhere in those days. And one of the challenges there was all these people were going to have to move, and in Arlington Hall, they set up what they called the Meade-mobile in this little trailer with these very nice young ladies looking like Red Cross nurses who would provide information about schools and housing and transportation in the Fort Meade area. And I guess the Meade-mobile was so famous that in the NSA newsletter, when the time came, here it featured on the cover with the move to Meade. And, again, you look at these newsletters and it's just, NSA, CIA, interestingly, had a culture of sort of being Ivy League, and NSA was very square and very middle American, and they would do all of these things. Here was the Fall Festival, with the horse show, and they had all these hobby clubs and so on, and they even had the Miss NSA beauty pageant, and I really like how, if you look closely, they have the number of each section. They were, it's Miss 12-83 or something. Well, of course, the other problem was that NSA had always had, from its beginnings in World War II, had this idea, our job is to get everything. And I think being unable to break the high-level codes gave an even greater imperative to that. And so there was always this situation of being overwhelmed with more data than they could process. And by as early as 1955, there were 37 tons of paper printouts a month being shipped by air to Fort Meade from intercept stations, 30 million words a month by teleprinter. This was actually, what you're seeing here is actually an intercept station, which had been partly computerized. And this was where NSA around 1960 developed the first high-speed modems. I mean, they developed this whole system where the intercept stations would digitally record the data, would pre-process it on these Honeywell computers, transmit it in bulk to NSA where it would be automatically uploaded on computers. So it was a great technological success in one sense, but it was also just overwhelming them with more than they could handle. Now, the Soviets, as I mentioned, had all along put a lot more emphasis on spies and bugs. And they were past masters at this. This was the famous Great Seal bug that was discovered in the American ambassador's office in the embassy in Moscow. And it was an absolutely brilliant bug. It was hidden inside this carving of the Great Seal presented by the equivalent of the Russian Boy Scouts, and it was all very nice and hung on the wall right there. And it contained this totally passive bug that had been developed even more interestingly by Leon Theremin. Some of you may have heard of the musical instrument, the theremin that goes woo, you know, you wave your hands around. And he invented this, and he had come to America in the, I think it was the 20s or 30s, and had become sort of famous with his electronic musical instruments. Then he vanished, 39 I think it was, or 38, the worst time to be going back to the Soviet Union. He was jailed, and he was put in one of these bizarre Stalinist jails where they put all of these technical experts, and he was told to invent things that would help the Soviet government. And he invented this thing, which the Americans in fact called the thing when they discovered it. And it, unlike a bug, you know, normal bugs, you think, well, it's a radio transmitter, right? Or it's a microphone. And this was an absolutely brilliant passive device. You would have a beam of radio waves being beamed in from some building outside. It would bounce off this antenna, and this little chamber above would change its shape from the sound waves in the room. There was a little diaphragm, and it ended up being essentially like an FM radio system. And then they would pick up the reflected waves and be able to demodulate it and pick up the voice. This is not Maxwell Smart's shoe phone, but it was a bug that was found in the deputy chief of mission shoe in Romania in 1969. He had sent out his shoes to be repaired, and unbeknownst to him, this bug had been placed inside it. There was the famous typewriter bugs in the Moscow embassy. And then there was, as I mentioned, spies. If you can't break a code, as I said, you can always steal it. And after the capture of the Pueblo, you remember, by the North Koreans, one of the things they got on the ship was this high-level U.S. Navy cipher machine. Now, America's cipher experts were absolutely convinced, and I think, and rightly, it didn't matter if they captured one of the machines, because the rotors were continually being changed with new ones, and unless you had the daily setting information of what position do you set these rotors to initially, it would take forever for somebody to try every possibility, even if they had the machine. But what the Russians also had was a spy, John Walker, one of the most notorious spies, a naval officer, who completely sold the Russians the daily key list. He was even provided this little nifty device that the FBI called a rotor reader by the Soviets, which allowed him to quickly work out the internal wiring of any new rotors and provide that information. You know, when you read the history of KGB spies, one of the things that's striking is how cheap the KGB was. They would give these guys chicken feed. Walker, they didn't give chicken feed to. They gave him over $1 million because they knew this was worth it. Well, as I mentioned, probably by the late 70s, the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, through a combination of things, supercomputers, this is the Cray-1, really the first supercomputer and the first supercomputer NSA had, some mathematical breakthroughs, it looks like NSA started to achieve some important breaks in high-level Soviet codes. But by then, again, the larger historical shift, I think, was more important towards interception and bugging at the source, at one end or the other. Admiral Bobby Inman, who you see here, that's actually with Frank Rowlett, who was one of William Friedman's 3 mathematical hires back in 1930. Here he's showing him around the NSA prototype museum back then in the 70s, one of these World War II devices. But Inman put great emphasis, too, on close access, as it was called, methods. You know, there's no point in going to all the work of breaking a code if you can tap into the message at the beginning or the end. NSA and CIA both wanted a piece of this action because it was where the action was of, you know, bugs, listening device, you know, posts in embassies abroad. And there was a real dysfunctional rivalry about this for many years. But when Inman came in, his predecessor had just negotiated what was called the peace treaty between NSA and CIA on sharing this. And there were still some issues to be resolved, and Inman was working on this. And for a brief period, he was both NSA director and acting CIA director. So he sent memos back and forth to himself approving his solutions. And he was actually one of the few people who was willing to speak to me for this book. And he said, he told me about this, and he said, you know, never have the 2 agencies worked so well together. But the result was this facility at College Park, Maryland, seen here courtesy of Google Maps, I think. This joint facility, I think NSA and CIA take turns with the chairmanship, which is handling all of that. And, you know, that's been the history ever since, and that's really where we are today with, you've heard of all of the Snowden revelations about PRISM and upstream, or is it downstream collection? I can never remember. And that's the name of the game these days, isn't it? It's, I'm sure there's a lot of code breaking that still goes on, but with the increasingly powerful encryption capability that's so widespread, clearly the name of the game is intercepting the unencrypted version of the message at the beginning or the end, or where it passes through somewhere and you can get at it, rather than breaking your head trying to break the codes. Well, I'd be very happy to answer any questions you may have if we have some time. I guess we do. And let's see, you're going to need to wait for one of the folks with the microphones to come with you to ask your questions.
Hi. For the American spies that were selling information to the Soviets, what was their motivations? Were they communists? Were they blackmailed?
Well, no, it varies quite a bit. In World War II, it was absolutely ideological. And, you know, Klaus Fuchs, who was probably far more important than the Rosenbergs in giving the Soviets information on the U.S. atomic program, he was completely ideological. He was incensed, in fact, one time when they offered him some money, and he said, no, I'm doing this to save the world. And the later spies, Walker, some of the other spies that NSA dealt with from the 60s on, it was absolutely, they were in it for the money. They were, one of the first spies that NSA found around in the 60s, he was I think an Army sergeant, and he was, you know, up to his neck in hock. He had bought these fancy sports cars, racing hydroplanes, this stuff, and he thought, hey, what's the easiest way for me to make money? And it was going to the Soviets. But I think that's been the trend. You know, certainly in the 40s and the 30s, and I think even partly in the 50s, it was absolutely ideological. And, you know, it was interesting. During the war, there was this feeling on their part, well, they're our allies, and we're keeping the secret from them, and world peace will be enhanced if they share in this knowledge. And it's, again, I think rather hard for us to get our minds around, but it's an important part of history to try to understand. Yeah, back here. Wait for the microphone.
David Ignatius just published a book called Quantum Spy, and he talks about the Chinese attempts and program to steal research secrets. Do you have anything you can comment on that? And is that as...
Yeah, that's my knowledge sort of ends at 1978. But it's all I can say. All I know is what I read in the papers. But I mean, there's no doubt that in the last 10 or 20 years, they've certainly been after proprietary corporate, kind of research information. They've definitely been going after intellectual property in a big way, and they've almost made no bones about it. I mean, I think the theft of industrial secrets in some ways has become as important as military and government secrets.
Thank you. Today's modern smartphone, I guess, could encrypt almost anything. Does it make it really extremely difficult for law enforcement to, catch criminals and break codes?
Yeah.
And what could be done about it?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And this is exactly the perfect illustration of the point I was making about the shift in the advantage to code making over code breaking. I mean, again, you have something, I worked out the numbers once. I mean, it's an unbelievable increase in order of magnitude of how much more powerful what you have in your pocket than the German Enigma machine was. It was something like 10 to the 60th. I mean, it was, it's trillion times probably more powerful. It's a little bit of a funny game because we don't really know what NSA's capabilities are. There's been some suspicion that the emphasis on law enforcement of saying, no, you, the manufacturers, must provide us a key that maybe could be put in some kind of public escrow, the courts would hold them, and then if we get a court order, we'd be allowed to break into this because we can't possibly break it. There's some suspicion this is smoke NSA is blowing to cover up what their actual cryptanalytic abilities are. But, certainly I think, average law enforcement has been a problem. I mean, unlocking these keys on smartphones and, encrypted communications going across the internet. I don't think anyone would deny it's a much more difficult problem than it was in 1948 or 1978 or 1998. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk and the information. And I have a two-part question. One is, it appears during those 30 years that the Soviets were successful in breaking our codes?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, that's the first question.
Yeah, they were successful in keeping their codes from being broken.
Okay. Second is, during that time period, were we, unbeknownst to everyone else, were we vulnerable militarily and strategically because of the lack of ability to get...
That's a very good question. And listen, I should qualify my first answer. I mean, certainly the Walker information allowed them to, you could say, break. I mean, they weren't breaking it out of cleverness. They had the results handed to them. So yes, they were deciphering important U.S. naval communications at the highest level. And that was definitely a vulnerability. But by that time, we had a lot of other resources, particularly overhead capability, satellites, which could detect missile launches in real time, starting to be able to do that. So SIGINT wasn't the be-all and end-all of strategic warning. And, there was a very ironic stabilizing influence from the ability of the Soviets to successfully bug mainly some of our high-level communications. In 1945, one of the British codebreakers, senior official at Bletchley Park, had set out his ideas about the post-war order and what should become of their code-breaking capability. And he said, you know, the greatest measure we could take for world peace would be to outlaw by treaty the transmission of coded communications. And he said, this is probably a counsel of perfection. But that's sort of what happened, because, you know, the one thing I didn't mention that also the Soviets were very successful at was bugging in Washington in the 70s, early 80s. There was a lot of traffic, ordinary telephone communications that went over microwaves at that time. And the Soviets were well positioned, particularly at their dacha on the Eastern Shore, to just scoop this up. And when the KGB archives were opened briefly in the 90s, it came out that had actually been able to listen to what Henry Kissinger was saying, had actually reassured the Soviets that we weren't planning some nefarious, because, you know, the Russians were, I mean, they're the masters of conspiratorial thinking. And they thought, there was one, you know, Reagan at one time made some announcement about, oh, we found some Russian combat brigade in Cuba, and the Russians went, oh God, is this going to be a pretext for a crisis? And they were reassured, listening to Kissinger and other people talk, that nothing was happening. So ironically, this transparency was a stabilizing force against some of the Soviet paranoia, which might have actually led to the kind of escalation which, you know, in all the war games about nuclear escalation, there's a blind spot. You're in the position of saying, do I have to push the button first because they're about to? And so, you know, it's interesting, these sort of unintended consequences, which are part of the game of mirrors that espionage and intelligence is.
It was reported that Snowden not only revealed our listening efforts, but also revealed much other information unrelated to that was of value to China and Russia.
Yeah.
Could you please comment on that and the damage that was done?
Well, again, you know, I'm really, this is not my area of expertise, but I've looked into this a bit. And it's certainly the case that Snowden did far more than simply blow the whistle on some, you know, U.S. programs, surveillance programs of questionable legal authority. There were things that he released which definitely impacted ongoing operations that is hard to justify, I think, in anybody's book. Particular devices that were used in, you know, kind of bugs in office equipment that apparently had been, you know, planted in foreign embassies, radio frequencies that were being monitored of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think those unquestionably did damage to ongoing U.S. operations of a kind that, if you believe in intelligence at all, you would have to say are completely legitimate and have nothing to do with the question of surveillance of American citizens. So, yeah, I mean, you know, Snowden's an interesting case, and we certainly haven't even begun to get the full story of what his motivations were and why he decided to go to Moscow in particular, which is a very strange story. And, you know, I don't view him as the villain that I think everyone at NSA does, but I certainly don't view him as a hero or a whistleblower.
In your research, did you ever get into the Tempest issues at all? I noticed you didn't say anything about that, about why the buildings are built the way they are.
Yeah. Well, you know, with the discovery of these typewriter bugs in particular, there was this whole program called Tempest that was launched to electronically shield any kind of equipment that might inadvertently give away, like, what you're typing. The typewriter bugs were very interesting because it was these IBM Selectric typewriters, and if you all remember this, it had this golf ball that would turn, and it had two arms that would turn the golf ball. And what the Soviet bug that was very cleverly concealed did was it magnetically measured the movement of these arms, and just by how far they moved, they could figure out what letter was being typed. And there was a host of things like that, of emissions from computer keyboards, teletype equipment, and so, you know, that was, and I think, I discussed this a bit in my book, and it was the tip of the iceberg, they realized. I mean, the Americans realized, they thought, you know, it was like, where does this end of the things you have to shield? I was actually the fortunate beneficiary of Tempest when I worked my year at OTA for Congress, because at the very end of the year, I had nothing to do for about a month. And luckily, the only Tempest-approved IBM PCs at that time had a video card in them. So I was able to play video games on my computer, and nobody else, you know, normally in the government they only had the text card. So, but yeah, it was a nightmare of a problem. And you know, you read what these guys wrote. I mean, they thought, well, yeah, we can try to mask it, and they would try to mask it. It would only make the problem worse, and it would be like, yeah, the guy could be sitting across the street and picking up these stray emissions from, you know, your computer keyboard, your teletype machine, and be able to copy what you're putting in.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
2 questions. What happened to Walker?
He went to jail. Didn't he die recently? I think so, yeah. He died in jail, yeah.
Died in jail, okay.
Yeah.
Second question, after World War II, and we'll only take you up to 1978, but after World War II, when did Congress and the administrations decide that there needed to be some laws kind of setting boundaries of what was going to be permissible?
Well, it was a couple of phases. NSA was created in 1952. Do I have that right? I think. And so there was basic enabling legislation then, but you know, the whole business of their authority to intercept communications was very murky. During World War II, there was official censorship, which meant any cables, you know, telegrams sent, the government was allowed to get a copy of. So that was all out in the open. So the war ended, censorship ended, and NSA's predecessor agencies basically went to the 3 leading, I mean, shades of recent stuff, went to the 3 leading telecom companies, you know, RCA, IT&T, and said, you know, we'd like to continue this arrangement. And they were, well, the head of, I think it was RCA, who had been in the Army, he said, he later told the congressional investigators, he said, well, he said, the Army asked me to do it. He said, by damn, that was good enough for me. But the others were they were all nervous. And they finally went to the Secretary of Defense, this was like 46, I think, and said, can you assure us the President of the United States has personally authorized this? And he said, yes, but I can't bind my successors or his successors. And it went on, sort of on autopilot. The real change came post-Watergate with the Church Committee investigation in 1978, which led to the FISA Act, Foreign Intelligence Security Act, the establishment of the FISA courts, which we've heard a lot about recently, which have to issue a warrant to authorize surveillance that involves an American citizen. And that was really the first time that NSA's surveillance was subject to clear legal, you know, delimitations.
Did Walker do more damage than Hansen?
Walker did a lot of damage. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think probably so. I mean, that's, you know, it's a sort of it's a hard one to quantify, and probably you'd need to really have a lot more access than I've ever had to be able to answer that. But I think Walker is viewed by many as the most damaging Soviet spy. Well, I think we're probably about out of time, but thank you so much.